Nick mentioned is about precautionary principles, which many of you will be familiar with from debates in public policy. So the general idea is that we should guard against certain kinds of especially severe risks. So principles like these are often appealed to in environmental policy, where we should guard against certain kinds of environmental catastrophes, or when it comes to new technologies. And we should guard against such especially severe harms, even if they are quite unlikely, or even if there's a deep uncertainty about how likely they are. But we can also think of such principles for personal decision making. So a precautionary principle for an individual might say something like you should guard against certain kinds of personal catastrophes, such as financial ruin, for instance. Now, what I want to do is raise a problem for such precautionary principles that is based on the observation that the kinds of especially severe harms that they want to guard against often arise as the consequence of engaging in incremental activities repeatedly over long periods of time. So think of a river that becomes polluted enough to pose serious health risks. It being that polluted will be the result of various different contaminants being released into the water by various different people over long periods of time. Or when the harms of catastrophic climate change occur, this is going to be the result of many different people, policymakers around the world, failing to take actions over many decades. Or in a personal case, serious risks to your health are often the result of engaging in unhealthy activities repeatedly over long periods of time, such as smoking, for instance. And I want to say that this simple observation about the kinds of risks precautionary principles want to guard against causes severe problems for what they're really intended to do. So, oops, let me jump right in here. Some examples of the kinds of principles I have in mind as they might occur in debates about public policy or in debates about good personal decision making. So statements like policymakers ought to make laws aiming to phase out or restrict activities that could plausibly lead to catastrophe. Individuals ought not engage in activities that pose a significant threat to the lives of others. Prudentially, individuals should not make choices that come with a substantial risk of financial ruin. So what these have in common is that they specify a threshold of harm and of likelihood of that harm beyond which some precaution is recommended, where this precaution might be omission of that activity or restriction of that activity. And importantly, they are not qualified by talking about the potential benefits that might also come from that activity. So as soon as the threshold of likelihood and harm is caused, we should take a precaution, no matter how costly that is, or no matter what the potential benefits are from keeping on engaging in the dangerous activity. And for that reason, precautionary principles such as these might come into conflict with the recommendations of risk-cost-benefit analysis or expected utility theory, because within standard risk-cost-benefit analysis or expected utility theory, we, no matter how bad a potential outcome is, we will still weight it against what the potentially good outcomes are that might occur. Everything is just weighted by its probability. But what these principles are saying is, once some potential harm is bad and likely enough, we shouldn't look at the potential upsides anymore. And for that reason, it might come into conflict with these standard decision rules. So I want to give 3 potential motivations for wanting to use such precautionary principles, despite the fact that they conflict with what is accepted to be the standard in the way of making public policy decisions, namely risk-cost-benefit analysis by many. One potential motivation is that risk-cost-benefit analysis might just be not risk-averse enough in the eyes of some. As it's standardly practiced, it's risk-neutral, and so is expected utility theory under standard interpretations. And proponents of precautionary principles in the policy context often stress that when especially important goods are at stake, we should be rather safe than sorry. We should be more risk averse than that. We shouldn't be risk neutral. But note that, so precautionary principles are a way of being more risk averse than the standard approaches. But note that it's not just giving greater weight to worst case outcomes, which is something that some alternatives to expected utility theory do, such as risk-weighted expected utility theory. Rather, what we're doing is that, as just mentioned, in the face of some risks, potential upsides of an activity just don't count anymore. A second motivation comes from deontological moral theorists. So there's been a debate for the last couple of decades, especially about how deontological theories should be implemented under risk. And deontologists have been challenged by some to explain how their theories would work under risk. So sometimes this is just taken to be the question of what should one do if it's not clear whether a deontological restriction applies to you. So on that picture, deontological restrictions are formulated for the case of certainty. And then we have another decision theory telling us what we should do when we don't know whether a deontological restriction applies. But another approach to implementing deontology under risk is just saying that there are deontological restrictions that apply to act types that incorporate subjective risk. So instead of introducing special rules for cases where it's uncertain whether a restriction applies, we formulate different kinds of restrictions in terms of the riskiness of the activity. So one example of this, and this is someone who's proposing this kind of approach to deontology under risk, is one may not endanger someone's life except in order to secure a very significant good. So this is Tenenbaum, 2017. So here, endangering is an act type that is characterized by its riskiness. So it's a deontological restriction on an act type that is taking a risk. It's not saying you shouldn't run a risk of engaging in the activity of killing. It's saying you shouldn't do the act type endangering somebody. And we can read this as a kind of precautionary principle. And in the public policy context too, we often see precautionary principles being defended as part of a deontological approach to policy evaluation. And a third motivation, and I think this is quite important in practice, comes from deep uncertainty and disagreement about what to do when there's a lot of uncertainty in public policy in particular. So in public policy, precautionary principles are most frequently appealed to in the face of risks that are really hard to quantify. So if we think of worst case climate change outcomes or questions about the regulation of new technologies. So there might be a lack of clear scientific evidence. There might be unknown unknowns. We haven't even thought of all the potential harms that might come from a new technology. Maybe the chances are small of a harm happening. It's hard to put a precise number on exactly how small they are. And there might be non-material harms or radical changes to human life that are hard to put a number on the value side. So these are the kinds of circumstances where precautionary principles are often proposed. And these factors make it quite hard to conduct a risk-cost-benefit analysis because in order to conduct a risk-cost-benefit analysis, we do need to put numbers on, we do need to come up with precise probabilities and with quantitative estimates of the values involved. And so in practice, there's going to be temptation to either just ignore the risks that are hard to quantify, and then we might end up with policies that are just too optimistic or that are reckless. Or we might just delay regulation until there's more evidence, and then we're procrastinating and potentially until it's too late. And all of these factors are also going to make the results of any risk-cost-benefit analysis controversial. So if we do put numbers on these things, they might not be agreed upon by the relevant experts or the public at large. And such disagreement and the controversy alone might be a further source for policy paralysis. So there's a danger of either recklessness or policy procrastination. So why is this a motivation for precautionary principles? Well, the idea is that they seem to do better in the face of risks that are really hard to quantify. Because all we need to know to determine whether precaution is required is, does the activity have potential consequences that pass some threshold of likelihood and severity? For instance, this is an example I'll come back to in a moment. Is there a plausible mechanism by which current levels of global CO2 emissions can lead to catastrophe if maintained? This is something we might need to determine to apply a precautionary principle. Now, this is likely to be much less controversial than any estimate of the precise social cost of carbon. It's easier to determine, less controversial, and therefore it seems there's less of a risk of paralysis or of ignoring deeply uncertain risks if we are guided by a precautionary principle that uses this as a condition for recommending precaution. And I think one important thing to note here is that this could potentially provide a pragmatic reason to adopt precautionary principles, even for those who believe that, in fact, expected utility theory or risk-cost-benefit analysis are otherwise normatively adequate, that this might be a good thing to settle on just so we get things done when there's a danger of paralysis. Okay, so let me state some desiderata for precautionary principles and the thesis of what I'm going to argue in the following. So no matter which your favorite motivation is for precautionary principle, they should ideally, firstly, make plausible recommendations in their target context. So I think this one is non-negotiable. We want these principles to not make highly counterintuitive recommendations. But we ideally would also like them to provide us with useful action guidance. So provide either policymakers in the policy context or individuals with useful action guidance, by which I mean it should be clear what it is that they recommend, and it should be relatively easy to work out for agents what it is that they recommend. And thirdly, ideally, they should also effectively constrain choice, by which I mean that if an agent can work out what it is that they recommend and accepts the normative authority of a precautionary principle, they shouldn't find it overly difficult to actually carry out what it is that the principle recommends. Now, I said the first one is non-negotiable. The second and the third one, depending on what your motivation is, you might be willing to give up on. So moral principles sometimes are not effectively action guiding, or they might be very difficult to come to go through with. So if your main interest in precautionary principles is that you're interested in what are the true moral principles under uncertainty, you might be willing to give up on 2 and 3. But I think for the policy applications, and if your motivation is the third point that I just made of overcoming policy procrastination, 2 and 3 are going to be quite important. And it's here in particular where the challenge that I want to bring in this talk is going to be important. So what I'm going to explore is an important obstacle for precautionary principles serving these functions well, which is that risks that are sufficiently likely and harmful to trigger application of a precautionary principle accumulate over time. And I will argue that this has 2 consequences. Firstly, to yield the normative verdicts that proponents of precautionary principles would like to make, they have to be understood to be diachronic principles, and this requires some added structure to how they're commonly formulated. And secondly, the structure of precautionary principles in their most plausible form actually invites policy procrastination in its own right. And this limits the extent to which it can, the precautionary principles can offer us hope in contexts where there's a temptation to put off action. Okay, so what I'm concerned with is, so I already used precautionary principles in the plural. There are many different kinds of precautionary principles that have been proposed in the literature, and they all, of course, differ in many different ways. But what I'm concerned with is principles that share this structure. So firstly, there is a threshold of likelihood and or severity of potential harm caused by one's activities, beyond which precautionary measures are required, where I'm taking omission to be one type of precautionary measure. Secondly, these thresholds are vague in the sense that there will be borderline cases. And thirdly, and this is more of an absence of structure, the principle doesn't specify explicitly the scope of the activity that it's meant to be applied to. So I'll give you 3 examples of precautionary principles that are proposed in the literature, which all exemplify these 3 different features. So the first one is a little bit different from the ones we've already seen because it's a maximum principle. So it says the option with the best worst case outcome that meets some minimal level of plausibility should be chosen. The reason why it shares the features that I've just outlined is that it has this minimal level of plausibility threshold, which is a vague threshold of likelihood. The second one is one proposed by Steele, specifically for the context of climate change. He says if a scientifically plausible mechanism exists whereby an activity can lead to a catastrophe, then that activity should be phased out or significantly restricted. So scientifically plausible mechanism is at least in part a vague threshold of likelihood, and catastrophe is a vague threshold of harm. And lastly, one may not endanger someone's life except in order to secure a very significant good. This is one we've already seen. Endangering, part of this term endangering is a vague threshold of likelihood, which in this case might be context specific, of actually causing the death of somebody else. But in each of these cases, the scope of activity isn't made explicit. So the first one talks about options, the second one activities, and in the third one, it's also not clear what the scope of the activity is that might count as endangering someone's life. I just want to say a few things of why these principles have these features, that there's some sort of plausibility to why they have these features. So when it comes to the first one, there's a threshold of likelihood and or severity of harm. Well, for one, this kind of structure is needed to express the core intuition that especially bad outcomes warrant special measures. And then we have to say something about when does something count as an especially bad kind of outcome. And then a lot of precautionary principles have what Steele calls a tripod structure, where they have both a threshold of severity and a threshold of harm, and then a recommended precaution. So those are the 3 things why Steele calls it a tripod structure. Steele thinks that the structure allows us to flexibly guard against different kinds of risks because we can, for different contexts, adjust these 3 features of a precautionary principle in order to express what a proportionate response to a situation is. So we might think the worse the harm is that we want to guard against, the lower the level of likelihood can be to trigger you taking special precautions. So it having the structure means we can sort of adjust the different features of a precautionary principle to express what a proportionate response is. And lastly, I think pretty much all versions of precautionary principles that have been proposed have featured at least a de minimis rule about likelihood, which means which gives us a cutoff point below which the likelihood is considered to be negligible. Because if we take into account infinitesimally small chances, this has highly implausible consequences because most of our choices might have some extremely bad, unlikely consequences. And so if we don't have at least the de minimis rule, we might get complete paralysis. So these are some reasons why the first feature is a common feature of precautionary principles. Secondly, their vagueness. One reason why these thresholds, why proponents of precautionary principles might be tempted to make these thresholds vague is that this circumvents some worries about arbitrariness. So if we're specific about the harm and the precautionary principle being triggered, for instance, if there's a risk of 100 people dying, then we might ask, so what's the categorical difference between a risk of 99 people dying and 100 people dying? Secondly, we might think the normatively relevant concepts just are vague. What we're concerned with is whether there's going to be a catastrophe. That might be the normatively relevant concept, and that is a vague concept. And lastly, many core applications of precautionary principles, as we've just said, involve deep uncertainty. And if that is so, then even if the thresholds were sharp, we would still have borderline cases. So if we had a sharp probability featuring as a threshold in our precautionary principle, but we can't actually assign sharp probabilities, there will still be cases where it's not clear whether the risk in question falls below or above the threshold. And then in practice, even if the precautionary principle didn't feature vague thresholds, it would lead to borderline cases, and then everything I'm going to say later on will apply as well. Okay, so we've seen the three features of precautionary principles that, or the three features that kind of carve out the precautionary principles that I want to consider in this talk. My hypothesis now is that it's possible and actually a common occurrence that many individual actions together result in a cumulative risk that crosses the threshold or thresholds of a particular precautionary principle, while each individual action does not. And I will show that this creates two problems. One is a problem of scope. So if the activity to which we apply the principle makes a difference, which scope or scopes should we apply the principles to? And secondly, a problem of execution, which is the problem of whether precautionary principles can effectively govern an agent's decision-making over time as they would have to. So to illustrate these problems, I'll present you with three cases of three highly stylized cases of individual decision-making. They might look fairly similar at the start, but they're similar in some senses, but they're also importantly different in a way that I'll bring out once I've confronted you with all of them. So the first case is a case of what I will call cumulative potential harm. So suppose that your 100 friends want you to invest in their startups. And suppose that the chance of failure for each of them is independent, and as it is with startups, the chance of failure is certainly non-negligible. But you wouldn't lose very much money on each. So just looking at one of the investments, you're actually disposed to invest in your friend's startup. However, you also think that it's possible that they all fail, which would mean financial ruin for you if you invested in all of them. So you are a cautious person and you formulate the following precautionary principle. If there's a plausible chance that some activity leads to financial ruin, then I should not engage in that activity. And you estimate that the antecedent holds true for the activity of investing in all of your friends' startups. But you also judge that it isn't true of any individual investment when you consider it in isolation, because you think that the loss from one investment never turns non-financial ruin into financial ruin. And otherwise, when you're not constrained by a precautionary principle, you're disposed to invest in your friends. And then the question is, what should you do in that kind of case? So this is the first case. Here's another case. I'll call it a cumulative likelihood case. You want to be a professional pianist, and one necessary condition for becoming a professional pianist is that you pass an upcoming performance exam. And you think that generally speaking, practicing more raises the chance of you passing your exam. And also, if you don't practice enough, there's a substantial chance that you're going to fail the exam. But also, each time slot that you could use for practice could also be used for more immediately pleasurable activities, for instance, playing a computer game. And you formulate the following precautionary principle. If an activity with no lasting importance to me leads to a substantial chance that I will fail my piano exam, I shouldn't engage in it. As before, you judge that the antecedent holds true for the incremental activity of, that holds true for the activity of spending every available practice time slot gaming instead of practicing. So if you never practice, there is a substantial chance that you're going to fail. But you also think that it doesn't hold true for any individual 1 hour time slot spent gaming instead of practicing, because you think that it never takes you from a non-substantial to a substantial chance of failing your exam. And you prefer gaming were it not for the exam. So if you think that you are unconstrained by the precautionary principle, you would be disposed to actually game instead of practice. And then again, the question is, what should you do? Now here's a third case, which is another cumulative likelihood case, but it's importantly different, and we'll see later on that out of the three, it's especially challenging. The question here is, should I cycle to work? Now here's a statistic I found. Don't ask me how they classified something as an accident, but in the UK, apparently there were 5,300 cycling accidents per billion miles cycled in 2018. And so I conduct the following rough and ready risk assessment, assuming there's independent risks between the different occasions. And the risk per mile of cycling is 0.00053%. So that turns the risk on a return trip to work to 0.004%. And that means that the risk in one working year is 0.96%. And I judge this to be sort of roughly in the right ballpark. Of course, I might not be representative in various different ways, but it's sort of roughly, it's roughly of the right magnitude. And again, I'm cautious and I formulate the following precautionary principle. If an activity leads to a non-negligible risk of accident and there's a significantly safe alternative available, I should take the alternative. Now I judge that the antecedent holds true for the activity of cycling for a year. So I think the risk would be non-negligible, and there's a significantly safer alternative, which is taking the train. Of course, this is a risk assessment that's been completely turned on its head by the current pandemic. But in this scenario, I judge that the antecedent holds true for the activity of cycling for a year. But at the same time, I judge it doesn't hold true for the activity of cycling on any given day, because I think that the risk of accident of ballpark 0.004 is negligible. And the benefits from cycling are quite tangible, and so otherwise I prefer cycling if I don't think I'm constrained by the precautionary principle. And again, the question is, what should I do? So I said there's some common structure to these kinds of cases. One is that in each of these cases, there's an incremental activity and an extended activity consisting in repeatedly engaging in the incremental activity. So there's cycling to work on one particular day, that's the incremental activity, and the extended activity is cycling regularly to work. And in each case, a precautionary principle constrains the extended activity, but it doesn't constrain any of the incremental activities if we consider them in isolation. And I've also said that the cases are subtly different. So in the first one, we've got the first one I call the cumulative potential harm case. Here, many incremental choices together create the possibility of a harm severe enough for the precautionary principle to bite. So it's the harm that, the potential harm that accumulates to at some point become severe enough to trigger the principle. In the other two cases, it's that many incremental choices together make harm likely enough for the precautionary principle to bite. So it's the likelihood that accumulates. But the way in which the likelihood accumulates is different in the two kinds of cases. The first one, let's call aggregating cumulative likelihood cases. So those are like the piano exam where the probability of me failing an exam in the future sort of becomes ever higher, but isn't resolved kind of along the way. So the probability of a harm happening on some future occasion becomes larger and larger the more often I engage in the incremental activity. Whereas in the cycling case, let's call it a transient cumulative likelihood case, what happens is that I take an independent risk on every single day, and the next day I will know whether harm was caused the day beforehand. So there isn't a sense in which the likelihood of the harm occurring sort of adds up over time. It's continuously, the uncertainty is continuously resolved. And so these are highly stylized cases of individual decision-making, but we find structurally similar, but of course, much more complicated cases in policy contexts as well. So we might think that the fact that the severe harms of climate change are a possibility is the result, that harms of that magnitude are a distinct possibility, are the result of engaging in polluting activities repeatedly. The aggregating cumulative likelihood cases here we might think of, for instance, research in technologies with potential dual use. We might think the more research is being created on this, the higher the possibility, the likelihood of the technology being misused on some future occasion becomes, or think of the continuation of the activities that raise the probability of a runaway greenhouse effect. And with the transient cumulative likelihood cases, we might think of, say, approval of clinical trials, or decisions about road safety, or the operation of nuclear power stations, where the longer we, so if we continue operating a nuclear power station, for instance, every day we'll know whether an accident has happened the day before, and that uncertainty about the past is continuously resolved. Okay, so the cases that I've given you, our analysis of these cases relies on the idea that incremental choices can never on their own make an agent cross the relevant threshold of harm or likelihood of a precautionary principle. So call this a tolerance assumption. The question is that a plausible assumption to make? So one first thing to say here is that if you find it intuitively implausible, one thing you can do is try and individuate the incremental choices more finely. So we talked about sort of time slots for piano practice. You might have thought of these as sort of 1 hour time slots, but what if we think about them as sort of 1 minute time slots? It becomes ever more plausible that it really doesn't make a difference for whether you're running a substantial or a non-substantial risk of failing your exam, whether you practice for 1 more minute. So one thing you can do is sort of think through the cases and individuate the incremental choices more finely. And in one case where this tolerance assumption is especially plausible, I think, is the transient cumulative likelihood cases, because in those cases, the tolerance assumption doesn't even rely on the vagueness of the thresholds. Because here, as risks occurred in the past are bygone, at the point of decision, later individual choices don't add to some growing likelihood of harm. So this is what's kind of definitive about these cases. So, so today I will know whether I had an accident cycling yesterday or not, and so the likelihood isn't accumulating. And so even if thresholds were sharp, it will never be the case that me cycling today is going to make me cross a threshold of substantial likelihood. So in the transient cumulative likelihood cases, this assumption is especially plausible. In the other 2 cases, so aggregating cumulative likelihood cases and cumulative potential harm cases, it's the vagueness of the thresholds that supports the tolerance assumption. And this is somewhat controversial. I'll go through this fairly quickly. We can come back to it in the discussion if you like, in case you're not if you're not interested in debates about vagueness. One thing to note is that the intuitive appeal of tolerance is already enough to undermine the effectiveness of precautionary principles. So if what we're interested in is effective action guidance, then this is already a problem. So you might buy into a theory of vagueness that would make you deny the relevant tolerance assumption, but it would still be very tough for an agent to be able to identify the precise point at which say cycling 1 more time is going to make you cross a particular threshold, or at the point at which practicing for another minute is going to make you cross the threshold of a substantial risk of failing your piano exam. It will be hard to identify and will be hard to feel the pull of a precautionary principle, because at least it seems like it's not going to make a difference. And for effective action guidance, that's already a problem. And it's here where I'll briefly mention theories of vagueness. I think no matter what the theory of vagueness is that you buy into, the tolerance assumption still has some plausibility to it, the tolerance assumption as we need it in these kinds of cases. So on contextualist approaches to vagueness, at least, tolerance is supported in the way that matters in our cases. So very briefly on contextualist views, there are sharp thresholds, say, between cases of substantial and non-substantial probability of or likelihood of failing your exam. But these sharp thresholds are never going to be where you're looking, as it were, on a place that you're actively considering. But if you're sort of thinking about whether you're constrained by precautionary principle to practice for another minute, then the sharp threshold is not going to be there. And so you're not going to be restricted by precautionary principle as you're actively considering practicing for another minute. On epistemicist views and supervaluationist views, which are arguably the other two famous views on vagueness, you get the result on epistemicist views that any individual incremental choice in the borderline region is very unlikely to make an agent cross the threshold. So here vagueness is a matter of impenetrable uncertainty. And when we've got when the incremental choices are individuated very finely, it's very unlikely for any one of them to make you cross a threshold. And on supervaluationist views, individual incremental choices in the borderline region, whether they make an agent cross the threshold, is indeterminate. And the problem that arises for applying precautionary principles to incremental choices then on these views is that they offer unclear action guidance, because we, to my knowledge, we lack good theories of decision-making under this specific kind of uncertainty or indeterminacy. So uncertainty about whether a deontological restriction applies in the case of epistemicism, and indeterminacy about whether a deontological restriction applies to you. It's unclear what an agent should do in that kind of situation. And moreover, unless we're very conservative about how agents should choose in such situations, these views on vagueness are still compatible with the assessment that incremental choices are unconstrained. So unless we say that if there's any possibility at all that this is a threshold, then we are constrained by it. So this would be a very conservative view. It's compatible with these views on vagueness that agents are unconstrained in their incremental choices. It's just sort of brief side remarks about this. As I said, we can come back to this if you like. I will, from now on, take for granted the tolerance assumption that grounds the assessment that incremental choices, if considered in isolation, are unconstrained, whereas extended activities are constrained. So what I've argued is that there are these cases where incremental choices are unconstrained, but extended activities are constrained. And this creates two problems, as I already announced. The first is a problem of scope. Which scope should we apply the principle to? And the second one is a problem of execution. So I think I should probably skip over some of these potential responses, or I discuss them fairly briefly. I think a first response to the problem of scope is to sort of deny the problem that there isn't really a divergence. Steele, for instance, has argued that the precautionary principle is really many precautionary principles, and it's really flexible and takes different forms and different kinds of applications. And so maybe our mistake was to try and apply the same precautionary principle to an incremental choice and to an extended choice. And perhaps context sensitivity is going to result in matching recommendations. If we use this right precautionary principle for the incremental choice, and the right one for the extended activity, maybe we get the same recommendations. There are two problems I want to raise for this. A first one is that in a true one-off isolated choice, it seems like precaution really doesn't seem to demand not investing or not cycling or not missing practice. If I really only ever consider going cycling this one time to work, it really doesn't seem like there's any good precautionary rationale not to do it. A real-world example where people have had these kinds of intuitions is the case of backscatter X-ray scans at airports. So these are now banned in the EU, but even when they were allowed, even the most concerned experts were saying that these are only really a problem for frequent flyers. So the radiation from these is low and only to the surface of the skin. And so the judgment there was it's only frequent flyers for whom this is a danger, even though the probability of health complications coming from this is independent on the different occasions. So if people only do it one-off, then there's no problem, was the judgment there. And I think we often make these kinds of judgments in cases of repeated risk-taking. And so granted that perhaps the relevant difference in context is whether the agent faces a set of similar choices or not. But there's a question of why would that make a difference? And the most plausible answer is because the agent could take large risks in the set of choices considered as a whole. But I think that's just a way of considering precaution from the perspective of the larger scope activity, of having answered the problem of scope by saying we should take a large scale perspective. And it's not a way of saying that precaution actually takes the same form when we consider it from all perspectives. And I think, well, I'll just briefly mention this. One thing one might say is that maybe we should just accept framing dependence, that agents are just free to frame the problem as they wish, even if this leads to differing kinds of recommendations. But I think this is implausible. Such frame dependence is usually taken to be irrational. And we might think it's especially implausible that morality would be permissive in that kind of way. And moreover, it doesn't help us with this problem of kind of overcoming procrastination and dealing with especially harmful risks, because where agents are prone to short-term framing, precautionary principles would be completely ineffective, but the short-term framing might be part of the problem. And I think I'll skip this bit and turn to a response that you might have had sort of all along. Isn't the proper response to these kinds of cases that we should look at a large scope, that we should have a large scope framing of these kinds of decision problems? And I want to consider two slightly different responses together. One is people in the policy contexts judging that when the problem of scope is acknowledged, judging that the principle should just be applied at a large scope. We should look at individual choices in the context of a larger temporally extended activity. And we also see the response, or we see the view in the deontology under the risk literature that precautionary principles should actually just be applied at all potential scopes. And these are slightly different responses, but my analysis of these is going to be similar. So problem here is that at the limit, an agent or policymaker could consider all of her life's choices as an activity. So this is easier to make sense of for an individual agent. For a policymaker, it's kind of unclear what is the largest possible scope of activity you can consider, but think, for instance, of kind of all of the choices of a society over many decades. Potentially, we could take such a sort of global perspective on all of the activities an agent could engage in. And the worry here is that at this global scope, the precautionary principles that are usually proposed would end up recommending implausible levels of precaution. So usually they say things like, we should avoid more than a non-negligible, we should avoid more than a non-negligible risk of some kind of catastrophic outcome, catastrophic on the social scale or catastrophic on an individual kind of scale. But if we look at, for instance, an individual, it would be implausible to recommend that an agent should, that an individual should avoid taking non-negligible risks of personal catastrophe viewed over her entire life. That seems too risk averse. And clearly, when we take a global perspective, the threshold for what kinds of risks are acceptable to take are quite different from the thresholds of acceptable risks to take when we look at shorter term activities. And so what's plausible from the global scale would be more something like, you shouldn't take more than a small risk of personal catastrophe. So what's plausible from the global scale in terms of the thresholds will be different from what's plausible on a smaller scale. And at the global scope, then only different, very general precautionary principles are going to be plausible, like taking a small rather than a non-negligible risk of personal catastrophe. And the worry about those is that they don't provide very much specific action guidance. So it might be compatible with taking only a small risk or taking no more than a small risk of personal catastrophe that I ride regularly, a motorbike without a helmet, as long as I take lots of other precautions in all other areas of my life. So the kinds of precautionary principles that are plausible at the global scale are not going to give very much specific action guidance. They will rule out certain lifestyles, but they probably won't rule out very many specific activities. But then proponents of, especially the first view here, might just deny that we should go global, but that we should choose a sort of medium-term timescale, that we shouldn't just look at incremental activities, but we also shouldn't look at the global scope, sort of something in between, a large but not the global scope. But then the worry is, where exactly should we stop? I find it difficult to see what a principled answer to that question would be. And we can't just say, pick the scope that gives you the right result, because then the precautionary principle is not doing any kind of action guiding work. So the problem here, sort of to summarize, is the potential of implausibility at the global scope. And so what I want to propose here is to avoid this problem of implausibility at the global scope. And the other problems that I mentioned is that we should give some additional structure to precautionary principles. And one proposal here is just making the scope explicit in the precautionary principle. So something like in the cycling case, if a series of commuting decisions over the course of a year leads to a non-negligible risk of accident, and there are other significantly safer but not significantly more costly alternative series of commuting decisions I could make, I should take one of these alternatives. And what this does is it avoids having to supply and justify some separate answer to the problem of scope, giving a sort of general answer to how we should individuate the choices the principles apply to. But the intended scope is now just part of the principle. And in that way, the principle can, in a sense, be action guiding on its own. And so for that reason, I take this to be the best solution to the problem of scope if effective action guidance is an important desideratum, because this helps the principles being effectively action guiding and makes them work as diachronic principles, which they will have to be if we want to guard against those kinds of risks that accumulate over time. So I wanted just to stress that that this is motivated by effective action guidance, because there might be other ways of adding structure that, again, you can ask me about in the Q&A, that also avoid these problems, but that don't deal so well with, or that aren't as effectively action guiding as just simply writing the scope into the principle. But importantly, this requires revisions to precautionary principles as commonly stated, because they don't usually say anything about the scope of activity they're supposed to be applied to. And I think that's a danger, because it on the one hand, creates the possibility of people just avoiding being constrained by it by individuating their choices too finely, and sort of using that as an excuse not to do anything about the risk. or people applying it at too global a scope and then saying, look, this principle is highly implausible. It's sort of, it restricts human progress. So we can deal with these two kinds of dangers by making the scope explicit in the principle. But it makes precautionary principles explicitly diachronic, and it means we're adopting a formulation of the principle that makes it work as a diachronic principle. Okay, so this was my treatment of the problem of scope. The execution problem is a little bit quicker to deal with. I'm sorry, I'm hopefully not going to go over time with this one. So remember, the execution problem is the problem of whether these principles are going to be effectively action guiding, and in a diachronic context, can they govern an agent's extended decision making? Now, consider again the cumulative potential harm and likelihood cases, and suppose that we've settled on a precautionary principle which constrains the extended activity. So for instance, if there's a plausible chance that my financial investments in any 1 year period lead to financial ruin, then I should invest differently. Now, each incremental choice here doesn't on its own cause the extended activity to cross the vague thresholds of harm and likelihood of the principle, for the same reasons that we said earlier that they don't constrain incremental activities when considered in isolation. They also don't make an agent cross the threshold of the, they don't make an agent's extended activity cross the threshold of the principle. And the execution problem is, can this principle nevertheless effectively govern decision-making over time? And I want to mention two problems for this. The first one sort of builds on a fairly well-known problem, whereas the second one is distinct for the problem of transient likelihood cases, and I think so far unacknowledged. So the first one applies to the cases where vagueness is the reason for what we call the tolerance assumption holding. Incremental choices that cumulatively bring about a vague harm or undermine a vague end have been argued to be especially prone to procrastination. So we find these arguments, especially in discussions of the self-torture problem, for instance, for those of you who are familiar with this. And for similar considerations, precautionary principles that have vague thresholds are subject to problems of potentially causing procrastination in the cumulative potential harm and likelihood cases. So the thought here is that each incremental choice doesn't make a difference to whether the agent abides by the restriction of the precautionary principle or not, and otherwise is quite attractive. And therefore, to abide by the restriction of the precautionary principle, the agent is going to have to arbitrarily pick some incremental choices not to perform nevertheless. And this is going to be hard to implement. It invites procrastination every time you can say, well, it's tomorrow that I'm not going to, I'm going to practice tomorrow. Today I want to play my video games. So there's always this temptation to postpone not engaging in the incremental activity. And abiding by it arguably requires planning and commitment of saying, you know, 1 day a week I'm going to allow myself to game, and then actually going through with that kind of plan. And this undermines the effective action guidingness of the precautionary principle. The second problem has to do with bygone risk, and this applies to the transient cumulative likelihood cases only. And here the thought is that unless agents take bygone risks into account, they will likely never feel pressure not to perform an incremental choice in this kind of case. So take the cycling case again. There isn't much pressure to refrain from cycling on the very first day of a 1 year period, because there's still many, many future occasions on which you can refrain from cycling in order to keep the total risk negligible. And on the next day, you know that you didn't have an accident yesterday. Supposing that you didn't. And it's therefore quite natural to no longer take yesterday's risk into account. So either you could do this by just no longer considering 1 year series of choices whose risk has resolved and only look to future 1 year periods, Or you could, from your ex-post perspective, just consider yesterday to be a no-risk day because you know there wasn't any harm yesterday. And either way, there's then again no pressure to refrain from cycling. It's as if you were facing the risk for the very first time. But then if you continue reasoning this way, you're always going to cycle to work. And then the precautionary principle just hasn't constrained your choices at all. Now, I find this case genuinely puzzling. So on the one hand, this reasoning isn't obviously mistaken. So the risk from yesterday is bygone. It seems irrelevant. Or why should that in any way influence my decision-making today, now that I know that I didn't have an accident yesterday? And if it's not mistaken, then the implication is that precautionary principles might just be inapplicable to transient cumulative likelihood cases. But on the other hand, sort of from the ex-ante perspective, the inability to constrain transiently risky choices does seem really problematic. So if we, and some of the kind of standard applications of precautionary principles seem to have this kind of structure, like continuing with activities that have some risk of accident, like continuing having nuclear power stations. So important applications of precautionary principles seem to have the structure, and it does seem problematic if precautionary principles couldn't constrain us in situations that have this kind of structure. And in any case, the attraction of reasoning that ignores bygone risk and the unnaturalness of taking it into account at least form another and sort of distinct from the vagueness point obstacle to implementing precautionary principles. Okay, so to summarize, I gave the following 3 desiderata for precautionary principles. They should ideally make plausible recommendations, they should provide useful action guidance, and they should effectively constrain choice. And what I've discussed is one important obstacle to precautionary principles serving this function well, namely that risks that the kinds of risks that are intended to be tackled by the precautionary principles are often the result of agents continuously engaging in certain kinds of activities. And this has 2 important consequences. In response to the scope problem, to fulfill the first and second desideratum, to give plausible recommendations and useful action guidance, precautionary principles need some additional structure to work well as diachronic principles. And I've proposed that we should just write the intended scope into the principle. And secondly, the problem of execution undermines the third desideratum in the kinds of cases that we've discussed here. The structure of the principle in their most plausible form invite procrastination in their own right. So we should do well to not kind of pin all of our hope for tackling policy procrastination in the face of uncertain harms on precautionary principles. The usefulness for this purpose is likely limited because of these problems. And this is it. Thank you very much.